My name is Victoria Hayes, and 6 months ago, I was sitting in seat 11C on what should have been a routine flight from Chicago to Denver. I had my laptop open, working on quarterly reports for the consulting firm that had just terminated my contract. The reason? A whistleblowing incident that had cost me my reputation, my career, and nearly my freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The turbulence hit us suddenly over Nebraska. Not just any turbulence, the kind that sends oxygen masks dropping and has flight attendants scrambling for their crash positions. I was reviewing the final details of my wrongful termination lawsuit when the Boeing 737 began shaking like a paint mixer. Captain Marcus Thompson's voice crackled over the intercom, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tension. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some severe weather. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. That's when the real crisis began. A passenger in 14B started having what looked like a heart attack. The flight attendant, Lisa Park, was calling for medical assistance when the plane suddenly dropped what felt like 1,000 feet. The man in 14B wasn't just having a heart attack, he was Derek Sullivan, the corporate executive who had orchestrated my downfall 3 months earlier. As Lisa struggled to help Sullivan while the plane pitched violently, I heard something over the cabin noise that made my blood freeze. The distinct sound of military aircraft engines. Through the small window, I could see them, 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons flying in perfect formation alongside our commercial airliner. Other passengers were pointing and gasping, but I knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't a medical emergency anymore. This was a national security incident. Captain Thompson's voice returned, but this time it was different. Clipped, professional, scared. We are being escorted by military aircraft to Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions. The woman next to me in 11B grabbed my arm. What's happening? Why are fighter jets escorting us? I couldn't answer her because I was staring at Derek Sullivan, who, despite his apparent medical crisis, was watching me with cold, calculating eyes. He wasn't having a heart attack. He was executing the final phase of whatever plan had destroyed my life. As we descended toward Peterson Air Force Base with our military escort, my mind raced back to why Derek Sullivan wanted me destroyed so badly. 3 months earlier, I had been Victoria Hayes, Senior Risk Assessment Consultant for Meridian Defense Contractors. My job was to evaluate the safety and security protocols of military equipment before it reached active duty personnel. What I discovered during a routine audit changed everything. Meridian had been systematically falsifying safety reports on critical aircraft components, parts that were installed in the very F-16s that were now escorting our plane. The falsified reports covered up metal fatigue issues that could cause catastrophic failures during high-stress maneuvers. When I tried to report this through proper channels, I found that the corruption went deeper than just one company. Sullivan, as Meridian's Vice President of Operations, had been coordinating with Pentagon officials to fast-track approvals in exchange for lucrative consulting contracts after their military service ended. I had documented everything, the falsified metallurgy reports, the bribery schemes, the communications between Sullivan and his Pentagon contacts. But when I submitted my findings to my supervisors, I discovered that Meridian owned the consulting firm I worked for. Within 48 hours, I was terminated for fabricating evidence and attempting corporate espionage. Sullivan had been thorough. He planted fake documents in my work files, hired witnesses to testify that I had been unstable and vindictive, and even managed to get federal investigators to open a case against me for industrial sabotage. The media painted me as a disgruntled employee trying to destroy a patriotic American defense contractor. But what Sullivan didn't know was that before joining the consulting world, I had spent 8 years as a quality assurance officer in the Air Force's Materiel Command. My call sign had been Hawk because of my ability to spot defects that other inspectors missed. I had personally overseen the safety certification of over 200 military aircraft, and my recommendations had prevented dozens of potential crashes. I had kept my military background quiet in the corporate world, using only my civilian credentials. But now, as our plane touched down at Peterson Air Force Base, and I saw the ground crew's reaction to our escorted arrival, I realized my past was about to catch up with my present in ways I never expected. We were held on the tarmac for 2 hours while military personnel boarded the plane. What they found during their inspection of Sullivan made it clear why we had been diverted. He was carrying classified documents that he wasn't authorized to possess, hidden in a specially modified briefcase that had triggered air traffic control security systems. Colonel James Rodriguez, the base commander, interviewed each passenger individually. When he reached seat 11C, his demeanor changed completely. "Victoria Hayes," he said, reading from his tablet. "Former Air Force Quality Assurance Officer. Call sign Hawk. You flagged 17 critical safety issues during your service. That prevented aircraft losses and saved countless lives." I nodded, unsure where this was going. "Ms. Hayes, we need your expertise." "The documents, Mr. Sullivan was carrying contained details about ongoing safety investigations into F-16 engine modifications. We believe he was attempting to deliver classified information about these investigations to foreign competitors." That's when I realized Sullivan's plan had backfired spectacularly. He had orchestrated this flight, arranged to be seated near me, and planned to frame me as his accomplice in espionage. But what he hadn't counted on was the military recognizing me and understanding exactly who I was and what I represented. Over the next 6 hours, I worked with Colonel Rodriguez and his team to decode Sullivan's documents. What we discovered was worse than my original findings at Meridian. Sullivan hadn't just been covering up safety issues. He had been actively selling information about military aircraft, vulnerabilities to defense contractors in countries that were not necessarily allies. The false heart attack had been his attempt to destroy the evidence when he realized our flight was being tracked. But military medicine is thorough, and his medical emergency had been quickly exposed as performance theater. As we worked through the night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: purpose. For the first time since my termination, I was using my skills to protect the people who had once been my colleagues and comrades. But Sullivan had one more card to play. Through his contacts, he had convinced federal prosecutors that I was his partner in the espionage scheme. Even as we were uncovering his crimes, arrest warrants were being prepared with my name on them. The next morning, I found myself in the unusual position of being simultaneously under federal investigation and assisting a military investigation. Colonel Rodriguez had to make a choice: honor the federal arrest warrant or trust the evidence. We had uncovered together. He chose the evidence. In a secure conference room at Peterson Air Force Base, we presented our findings to a panel that included FBI investigators, Pentagon officials, and representatives from the Justice Department. Sullivan, now in military custody, sat at the opposite end of the table with his lawyers. Still maintaining that I was his co-conspirator, I laid out the timeline methodically. How my original safety audit had uncovered systematic fraud at Meridian. How Sullivan had destroyed my career to silence me. How he had planned to use this flight to frame me as a spy while delivering classified information to foreign agents. The evidence was overwhelming. Sullivan's modified briefcase contained not just classified documents, but also communications with foreign defense contractors and bank records showing payments for previous information sales. Most damning of all, we had recovered his real medical records, which showed no heart condition, proving that his emergency had been staged. But the moment that changed everything came when Colonel Rodriguez stood up and addressed the panel. Directly, "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I want you to understand who Victoria Hayes really is." During her Air Force service, she identified a defect in F-16 engine mounting brackets that could have caused in-flight structural failures. Her report led to the inspection and replacement of over 400 aircraft engines. Conservative estimates suggest her work saved the lives of at least 50 pilots and prevented the loss of $2.3 billion in aircraft. He turned to me. "Ms. Hayes, in recognition of your service then and your assistance now, I have a request." That's when the doors to the conference room opened and two F-16 pilots in full flight gear entered. Behind them came a delegation of Air Force officers I recognized from my days in Materiel Command. Victoria Hawk Hayes, Colonel Rodriguez, announced, "These pilots are alive today because of your work. They wanted to thank you personally." The senior pilot stepped forward and saluted. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Sarah Kim. 5 years ago, you flagged a stress fracture in my aircraft's wing assembly during a routine inspection. That fracture would have caused catastrophic failure during my deployment to Afghanistan. You saved my life." One by one, the other officers shared similar stories. Components I had flagged, safety protocols I had implemented, disasters I had prevented. Men and women who were alive because I had been thorough, careful, and unwilling to compromise on safety. Sullivan's lawyers had no response to this testimony. The federal prosecutors quietly withdrew their charges against me and redirected their focus to building the espionage case against Sullivan. 6 months later, I received an invitation that changed my perspective on everything that had happened. The Air Force was dedicating a new quality assurance training center, and they wanted me to be the keynote speaker. Standing before an audience of young Air Force officers, I realized that Sullivan's attempt to destroy me had actually led me back to where I belonged. Not in the corporate world where safety was secondary to profits, but in service to the people who put their lives on the line for others. I had turned down several offers to return to defense contracting. Instead, I founded the Hayes Aviation Safety Institute, a nonprofit organization that provides independent safety auditing services to military and civilian aviation. We work exclusively for transparency and accountability, never for profit margins. The flight that was supposed to be my lowest point sitting in seat 11C, unemployed and disgraced, had become the catalyst for my transformation. The fighter jets that had initially terrified the other passengers had turned out to be the angels that delivered me back to my true calling. Derek Sullivan was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for espionage and treason. Meridian Defense Contractors was dissolved, and several Pentagon officials lost their positions in the scandal that followed. But the moment I'll never forget happened 3 weeks after the Peterson Air Force Base incident. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was boarding another flight, this time from Denver to Washington, D.C., where I was testifying before Congress about defense contractor oversight. As I walked down the jetway, I heard the distinctive sound of military aircraft engines overhead. I looked up through the terminal windows and saw a formation of 4 F-16s performing a flyover for a ceremony at nearby Buckley Air Force Base. The businessman next to me noticed my attention to the aircraft. "Beautiful planes," he said. "Makes you proud to be American, doesn't it?" I smiled, thinking about all the pilots flying those aircraft whose lives had been touched, directly or indirectly, by the work I had done in the shadows. "Yes," I said. "It really does. Sometimes your purpose finds you in the most unexpected places. Sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want to discover what you're really meant to do. And sometimes, the seat you're assigned, even if it's just 11C on a routine flight, is exactly where you need to be to change the course of your life forever." The legend they saluted wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the quiet Dedication of people who choose to do the right thing, even when no one is watching, even when it cost them everything they thought they wanted. That's a legend worth living up to. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, have you ever had a moment where what seemed like your lowest point became the catalyst for discovering your true purpose? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to join a community that believes in second chances, hidden strengths, and the power of doing what's right even when it's difficult. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most important work we do is the work that goes unnoticed until the moment it saves lives. The memories came flooding back as I watched the ground crew scramble below our aircraft. 8 years in the Air Force had taught me to read situations quickly, and what I saw through that small window told me everything I needed to know about how serious this had become. The precision of the ground response, the immediate quarantine protocols, the way the military personnel moved with urgent purpose. This wasn't standard procedure for a medical diversion. My time at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base felt like another lifetime now. I had been 22 when I first walked into the sprawling complex in Dayton, Ohio, fresh out of the Air Force Academy with a degree in aeronautical engineering and stars in my eyes about serving my country. The Materiel Command Facility was where dreams of flight met the harsh reality of physics, metallurgy, and human error. It was where I learned that the difference between a successful mission and a tragedy often came down to microscopic details that most people would never notice. The Quality Assurance Division was housed in Building 620, a nondescript concrete structure that looked more like a warehouse than the nerve center of military aviation safety. Inside those walls, teams of engineers, technicians, and analysts worked around the clock to ensure that every bolt, wire, and component that went into military aircraft met the exacting standards that kept pilots alive. I had been assigned to the propulsion system safety team, focusing specifically on engine components and fuel delivery systems. My supervisor, Master Sergeant Robert Chun, was a 20-year veteran who had seen more aircraft failures than most people could imagine. He had a saying that he repeated to every new arrival: in this business, there are 2 types of mistakes, the ones that get caught in testing and the ones that get caught in the field. The field always costs more. He meant more than money. Of course, field failures cost lives, missions, and sometimes national security interests that extended far beyond any single aircraft. Chun taught me to think like an aircraft, not just to understand how components were supposed to work, but to imagine all the ways they could fail under stress. Heat expansion in desert conditions, metal fatigue from repeated high-G maneuvers, corrosion from salt air in maritime operations, vibration harmonics that could slowly weaken connection points over thousands of flight hours. Every possible failure mode had to be anticipated, tested, and either prevented or accounted for in maintenance protocols. My first major case came 6 months into my assignment. A routine inspection of F-16 engines had revealed what appeared to be minor scoring on several turbine blades. The damage was within acceptable tolerances according to the technical manuals, and the engines had passed all standard tests. Most inspectors would have signed off on them without a second thought. But something about the pattern of the scoring bothered me. It was too uniform, too symmetrical to be random wear. I spent 3 weeks analyzing those turbine blades, working late into the night with metallurgical microscopes and stress analysis software. What I discovered was that the scoring was actually the early stage of a resonance failure, a phenomenon where specific engine RPMs would cause the blades to vibrate at their natural frequency, gradually weakening the metal structure. The engines would function normally for hundreds of hours before the blades would suddenly shatter during high-stress maneuvers. When I submitted my findings to Chun, he initially dismissed them as the over-analysis of a rookie inspector. But I persisted, running additional tests and modeling various failure scenarios. Finally, he agreed to ground the affected engines and conduct deeper inspections. What we found validated my concerns completely. 17 engines showed early signs of resonance damage, and computer models indicated that 12 of them would have experienced catastrophic failure within the next 50 flight hours. The discovery led to a complete review of the manufacturing process and ultimately resulted in design modifications that prevented the resonance issue in future engines. More importantly, it established my reputation as an inspector who saw patterns that others missed. That was when Chun started calling me Hawk, not because of sharp eyesight, but because of what he called my predator instinct for finding weaknesses in complex systems. Over the following years, I applied that same analytical approach to dozens of aircraft systems. I identified structural weaknesses in landing gear assemblies that could have caused gear collapse during emergency landings. I discovered fuel line configurations that could create vapor lock under certain altitude and temperature conditions. I found electrical system vulnerabilities that could lead to complete avionics failure during lightning strikes. Each discovery meant hours of additional testing, redesigns, and sometimes heated discussions with contractors who didn't want to acknowledge problems with their products. The work was often frustrating and always thankless. When I prevented a failure, no one noticed because nothing bad happened. There were no medals for disasters that didn't occur, no recognition for pilots who came home safely because someone had caught a problem before it could kill them. The only time quality assurance got attention was when something slipped through, and then it was usually blame rather than understanding. But there were moments that made it all worthwhile, like the letter I received from Captain Maria Santos, an F-16 pilot who had been deployed to Afghanistan. She wrote to thank me for flagging a defect in her aircraft's environmental control system that would have caused carbon monoxide poisoning during high-altitude missions, or the commendation from a maintenance chief whose crew had been spared from a hangar explosion because I had identified a fuel vapor detection system malfunction. These were the victories that mattered, anonymous saves that kept families intact and missions successful. The transition from military service to civilian consulting had seemed like a natural progression. Defense contractors were always looking for former military personnel who understood both the technical requirements and the operational realities of military aviation. The salary was significantly better than military pay, and the work seemed like a continuation of my Air Force mission, ensuring the safety and effectiveness of military equipment. Meridian Defense Contractors had recruited me aggressively, offering a senior position with their quality assurance division and the promise of meaningful work on cutting-edge aircraft systems. During the interview process, they had emphasized their commitment to safety and their pride in supporting military personnel with the best possible equipment. Derek Sullivan, who was then a project director, had personally assured me that Meridian operated with the same attention to detail and dedication to excellence that I had known in the military. The reality was different from the first day. Where the Air Force prioritized safety above all else, Meridian prioritized delivery schedules and profit margins. Quality assurance was viewed not as an essential safeguard, but as an obstacle to be overcome as quickly as possible. My recommendations for additional testing were routinely overruled by managers who argued that military contracts included built-in safety margins that made rigorous civilian oversight unnecessary. I tried to adapt to the corporate culture, telling myself that private sector efficiency could coexist with appropriate safety standards. But as months passed, I saw more and more corners being cut in ways that would have been unthinkable in my military experience. Test protocols were abbreviated to save time. Component specifications were relaxed to accommodate supplier limitations. Documentation was simplified to reduce paperwork burden. Each compromise seemed minor in isolation, but together they represented a fundamental shift away from the safety-first mentality that had guided my entire career. The breaking point came during the audit of Engine Modification Package 7 Alpha, a upgrade kit designed to improve fuel efficiency and extend service life for F-16 engines. The modifications involved new fuel injector designs, updated combustion chamber linings, and revised control software that would optimize performance across different operational conditions. On paper, the improvements were impressive: increased range, reduced maintenance requirements, and better performance in extreme environments. But when I began examining the test data, I found inconsistencies that set off every alarm bell in my professional experience. Metallurgical reports showed different results for identical materials tested at different facilities. Stress analysis calculations contained mathematical errors that consistently understated the forces acting on critical components. Temperature testing had been conducted under conditions that didn't match the extreme environments where military aircraft actually operated. Most troubling of all, I discovered that several key tests had never been conducted at all. The documentation claimed that components had been subjected to high-cycle fatigue testing, but when I traced the serial numbers, I found that the actual test articles were still sitting in storage, never having been installed in test engines. Someone had simply fabricated the results and inserted them into the official reports. The implications were staggering. The modified engines were already in production, with delivery scheduled to begin within 60 days. If my analysis was correct, the modifications would actually reduce engine reliability and create new failure modes that could manifest during combat operations. Pilots who depended on these engines for survival would be flying aircraft that were less safe than the original configurations they replaced. I documented everything methodically, building a comprehensive case that traced each discrepancy back to its source. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. When I submitted my findings to my immediate supervisor, Thomas Brennan, I expected immediate action to halt production and investigate the falsified data. Instead, I was told that my concerns would be taken under advisement and that production would continue on schedule. Over the following weeks, I pressed for answers about the investigation, only to be told that my findings had been reviewed by appropriate personnel and found to be overly conservative, given the built-in safety margins of military specifications. When I requested access to the review documentation, I was told that it was proprietary information restricted to senior management. When I asked to speak directly with the senior managers, I was informed that they were too busy with critical project deadlines to meet with individual technical staff. The stonewalling was systematic and deliberate. My access to certain databases was revoked for security reasons. My requests for additional testing were denied due to budget constraints. My attempts to contact military liaison officers were blocked by administrative procedures that required pre-approval from management. It became clear that Meridian had no intention of addressing my findings, regardless of the safety implications. That's when I made the decision that would ultimately destroy my career and lead me to Seat 11C on that fateful flight. I decided to go outside the company with my concerns, following the whistleblower protocols that were supposed to protect employees who reported safety violations. I contacted the Defense Contract Management Agency, the Pentagon office responsible for overseeing contractor compliance with safety and quality standards. I submitted a detailed report documenting all of my findings, along with copies of the falsified test data and evidence of the systematic cover-up. The response was swift and devastating, but not in the way I had expected. Rather than launching an investigation into Meridian's practices, the DCMA forwarded my complaint back to Meridian management for internal resolution. Within hours of receiving the forwarded complaint, Derek Sullivan, who had been promoted to Vice President of Operations, called me into his office for what he termed a clarification discussion. Sullivan's demeanor was completely different from the supportive mentor who had recruited me. His voice was cold and his questions were precise, clearly designed to find weaknesses in my allegations rather than understand their substance. He questioned my methodology, my qualifications, and my motivations. He suggested that my concerns stemmed from my inability to adapt to civilian industry practices and my unrealistic expectations based on military experience. When I provided additional documentation to support my findings, Sullivan dismissed it as selective interpretation of complex data. When I offered to conduct additional tests to verify my conclusions, he claimed that such testing was unnecessary and would delay critical deliveries to military customers. When I mentioned my obligation to ensure pilot safety, he accused me of grandstanding and self-aggrandizement at the expense of practical business operations. The meeting ended with Sullivan informing me that my performance was being placed under formal review and that any further disruptive activities would result in immediate termination. He made it clear that my allegations had been thoroughly investigated and found to be baseless, and that any additional attempts to raise these issues externally would be viewed as corporate sabotage. But I knew what I had seen in those test reports, and I knew what it meant for the pilots who would fly those modified engines. The professional training that had been drilled into me during 8 years of military service made it impossible to simply walk away and hope someone else would catch the problems before they manifested in the field. I had seen too many investigations of aircraft accidents that began with the phrase, "multiple warning signs were present but not acted upon." So I made copies of everything. Every falsified report, every suspicious calculation, every piece of evidence that documented the systematic fraud I had uncovered. I stored them in multiple locations and prepared a comprehensive summary that could be understood by people without technical backgrounds. I researched other avenues for reporting safety violations, including congressional oversight committees and investigative journalists who specialized in defense contract issues. But before I could act on any of these options, Sullivan struck preemptively. I arrived at work one Monday morning to find my security access had been revoked and my personal belongings boxed up in the lobby. A security guard escorted me to a conference room where Sullivan and 2 people I didn't recognize were waiting with a stack of legal documents. They accused me of attempting to steal proprietary information for the benefit of competing contractors. They claimed I had violated my non-disclosure agreements by discussing confidential projects with unauthorized personnel. They alleged that I had deliberately sabotaged the testing procedures to create false results that would damage Meridian's reputation. Most damaging of all, they asserted that I had been in contact with foreign agents who were seeking information about American military technology. The accusations were both absurd and terrifyingly plausible. In the post-9/11 world, any suggestion of collaboration with foreign intelligence services was taken extremely seriously by federal law enforcement agencies. The mere allegation was enough to trigger investigations that could destroy careers and reputations, regardless of their ultimate outcome. Sullivan and his associates had clearly calculated that the threat of espionage charges would be sufficient to silence me permanently. They offered me a choice: sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from ever discussing my work at Meridian, accept a financial settlement that would compensate me for my termination and disappear quietly into the civilian job market, or face federal investigation for industrial espionage, theft of classified information, and violation of the Espionage Act. The decision should have been easy. I had no desire to spend years fighting federal charges that could result in decades in prison, even if they were ultimately dismissed. The financial settlement was generous enough to support me while I searched for new employment. The non-disclosure agreement would prevent me from exposing Meridian's fraud, but it would also allow me to walk away with my freedom and my reputation intact. But every time I considered signing those documents, I thought about Captain Santos and her letter thanking me for catching the environmental control system defect. I thought about the maintenance chief whose crew had been saved by my identification of the fuel vapor detection malfunction. I thought about all the pilots I had never met whose lives had been protected by the unglamorous work of finding problems before they became tragedies. I told Sullivan and his lawyers that I needed time to consider their offer. They gave me 72 hours to decide, making it clear that the offer would be withdrawn permanently if I didn't accept it within that time frame. They also reminded me that any attempt to contact outside parties about Meridian's business practices during those 72 hours would be viewed as a violation of my existing confidentiality obligations and would result in immediate legal action. I spent those 3 days researching everything I could about the people involved in the cover-up, the corporate structure that had enabled it, and the legal protections available to whistleblowers in the defense industry. What I discovered was that Sullivan's network extended far beyond Meridian. He had cultivated relationships with Pentagon procurement officials who had significant influence over contract awards and oversight activities. Several of these officials had received lucrative consulting agreements with Meridian after their retirement from government service. The web of relationships created conflicts of interest that compromised the very oversight mechanisms that were supposed to prevent contractor fraud. The people who were supposed to investigate my allegations had financial incentives to dismiss them. The system that was supposed to protect whistleblowers had been captured by the same interests it was meant to regulate. On the morning of the 4th day, I walked into Sullivan's office and informed him that I would not be signing his agreement. I told him that I would be pursuing every available avenue to expose the fraud I had documented, regardless of the personal consequences. I told him that the lives of military personnel were more important than corporate profits or individual careers, including my own. His response was immediate and comprehensive. Within hours, federal agents arrived at my apartment with a search warrant based on allegations of theft of classified information. My computers, phones, and personal files were seized as evidence. My bank accounts were frozen pending investigation of possible payments from foreign intelligence services. My security clearances were revoked, making me unemployable in the defense industry. The media campaign began the next day. Anonymous sources provided reporters with details about the federal investigation, characterizing me as a disgruntled employee who had attempted to sell military secrets to foreign competitors. The stories emphasized my access to classified information and my suspicious behavior in the weeks before my termination. Meridian's public relations firm issued statements expressing shock and disappointment about my alleged betrayal of trust. The narrative was perfect in its simplicity. A trusted employee with financial problems and personal grievances had attempted to profit by selling secrets to America's enemies. When confronted with evidence of her treachery, she had tried to deflect attention by making false accusations against her former employers. The whistleblower protections she claimed to be seeking were actually cover for espionage activities that threatened national security. The federal investigation dragged on for months, consuming my savings and destroying my professional reputation. Even though no evidence of espionage was ever found, the mere existence of the investigation was enough to make me untouchable in the defense industry. Potential employers were unwilling to risk their own government contracts by hiring someone under federal scrutiny. Former colleagues avoided contact with me to protect their own careers. Professional organizations quietly removed me from membership rosters to avoid controversy. The irony was bitter and complete. In trying to protect military personnel from defective equipment, I had been characterized as a traitor who threatened their safety. In attempting to expose fraud that could cost lives, I had been painted as someone who valued money more than human life. The very dedication to duty and country that had motivated my actions had been twisted into evidence of betrayal and sedition. By the time I boarded Flight 2847 from Chicago to Denver, I was a pariah in the only professional community I had ever known. The consulting contract that had been terminated was my last connection to the work I had trained for and loved. The lawsuit I was pursuing was a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of my career, though my lawyers had made it clear that the odds of success were minimal given the resources arrayed against me. I thought I was traveling to Denver to meet with one of the few attorneys willing to take on my case pro bono. I thought the man having a medical emergency in seat 14B was simply another passenger whose health had failed at an unfortunate moment. I had no idea that Derek Sullivan had orchestrated every detail of that flight as the final phase of his plan to silence me permanently. But as our aircraft descended toward Peterson Air Force Base with its military escort, I realized that Sullivan had made a critical error in his calculations. He had assumed that my military background was irrelevant to my civilian whistleblowing activities. He had dismissed my Air Force experience as outdated training that had little bearing on current defense industry practices. He had treated my quality assurance expertise as a liability that could be managed through legal and public relations tactics. What he failed to understand was that my 8 years in the Air Force had given me more than technical knowledge about aircraft systems. It had taught me to think systematically about complex problems, to follow evidence wherever it led, and to prioritize mission success over personal comfort. Most importantly, it had connected me to a community of professionals who shared those same values and who would recognize the significance of what I had discovered. As the wheels touched down at Peterson Air Force Base, and I saw the ground crews preparing to board our aircraft, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was in an environment where competence mattered more than politics, where safety was valued more than profits, and where doing the right thing was still considered more important than avoiding controversy. Sullivan had brought me back to the place where I belonged, surrounded by people who would understand exactly what was at stake and why it mattered. His plan to frame me as a spy had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of silencing me, he had given me the perfect platform to tell my story to people who would listen with the knowledge and experience necessary to evaluate its credibility. The military personnel boarding our aircraft weren't just processing another diverted flight. They were beginning an investigation that would ultimately expose everything Sullivan had worked so hard to conceal. And for the first time in months, I was ready to fight back with the full weight of the United States Air Force behind me. The first person to board our aircraft after landing was a young sergeant with a tablet and scanner, methodically checking each passenger's identification against some kind of database. When he reached my seat, his scanner beeped differently than it had for the other passengers. He looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen with obvious confusion. "Ma'am, could you please step to the front of the aircraft for a moment?" he asked, his tone respectful but urgent. I gathered my belongings and made my way forward, aware that every other passenger was watching with a mixture of curiosity and concern. At the front of the cabin, 2 Air Force security personnel were waiting with additional equipment that looked far more sophisticated than standard passenger processing gear. The senior officer, whose name tape read Martinez, spoke quietly. "Ms. Hayes, our system shows some unusual flags on your background check. We're going to need you to come with us for additional screening." I nodded, understanding that this was likely related to the ongoing federal investigation that had made my life miserable for the past several months. As we walked down the aircraft steps onto the tarmac, I noticed that Derek Sullivan was being escorted separately by military police officers toward a different building entirely. His earlier medical emergency had apparently been forgotten in favor of whatever security concerns had prompted our diversion. The processing facility at Peterson Air Force Base was a low, windowless building that looked like it had been constructed during the Cold War. Inside, the floors were polished concrete, and the walls were painted institutional beige. We walked through a series of security checkpoints, each more thorough than the last, until we reached a small conference room with a metal table and 4 plastic chairs. "Please have a seat, Ms. Hayes," Martinez said. "Colonel Rodriguez will be with you shortly." I sat down and waited, trying to process the surreal turn my day had taken. 12 hours earlier, I had been reviewing legal documents in my Chicago apartment, preparing for what I thought would be a routine meeting with my attorney. Now I was in military custody at an Air Force base, apparently connected to whatever had caused Derek Sullivan to fake a heart attack on a commercial airliner. The door opened and Colonel James Rodriguez entered, followed by a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of a federal agent. Rodriguez was tall and lean, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions under pressure. The woman introduced herself as Special Agent Lisa Park from the FBI. "Ms. Hayes," Rodriguez began, settling into the chair across from me, "we apologize for the circumstances, but we need to understand exactly what happened on that aircraft and how it relates to some ongoing security investigations." Agent Park opened a thick file folder and spread several photographs across the table. They showed the modified briefcase that Sullivan had been carrying, open to reveal sophisticated electronic equipment and what appeared to be classified documents. "Can you tell us about your relationship with Derek Sullivan?" she asked. I explained the history of my employment at Meridian, the safety violations I had discovered, and Sullivan's role in orchestrating my termination and subsequent persecution. Both Rodriguez and Park took notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification about technical details or specific dates. When I finished my account, Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "Ms. Hayes, are you familiar with something called the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Program?" I shook my head. The program name was unfamiliar to me. "It's a relatively new initiative designed to protect sensitive defense information from foreign intelligence services," Rodriguez explained. "Over the past 2 years, we've identified several attempts by hostile nations to acquire technical data about American military aircraft systems. The methods vary, but they often involve recruiting assets within defense contractors who have access to classified information." Agent Park picked up the narrative. 3 months ago, we received intelligence suggesting that someone at Meridian Defense Contractors was systematically collecting and transmitting sensitive information to foreign contacts. The operation appeared to be sophisticated and well-funded, with multiple layers of cover and misdirection. The implications of what they were telling me began to sink in. "You think Sullivan is a spy?" "We think Sullivan is part of a network that has been operating for several years," Rodriguez replied. "What we don't understand is why he would risk exposure by orchestrating this elaborate scenario on a commercial flight. That's where you come in." Agent Park spread additional documents across the table. They were copies of the safety reports I had filed during my time at Meridian, along with the evidence I had gathered about the falsified engine testing data. "We've been investigating Meridian for espionage activities," she said. "But your whistleblowing complaint opened up an entirely different line of inquiry. The safety violations you documented weren't just corporate fraud. They were deliberate sabotage designed to create vulnerabilities in American military aircraft." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had thought I was exposing corner cutting and negligence. I hadn't realized I had stumbled onto a systematic effort to compromise the safety and effectiveness of American military equipment. Rodriguez continued the explanation. "The engine modifications you flagged weren't just effective, they were designed to fail under specific conditions. An enemy that knew about these vulnerabilities could exploit them during combat operations, potentially causing mass casualties and compromising entire missions." "But why would Sullivan want to frame me?" I asked. "If I was exposing his operation, wouldn't it be simpler to just have me killed?" Agent Park smiled grimly. Because you have something that Sullivan desperately needs: credibility within the military aviation community. Your background as a quality assurance officer gives you exactly the kind of access and expertise that foreign intelligence services value most. They don't just want to steal information. They want to recruit assets who can provide ongoing intelligence and even influence future weapons development. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Sullivan hadn't been trying to destroy me out of spite or corporate self-protection. He had been trying to isolate me from my support networks and compromise me legally so that I would be vulnerable to recruitment as a foreign asset. The espionage charges, the media campaign, the destruction of my career, all of that was designed to make me desperate enough to consider working for foreign intelligence services. Rodriguez nodded. Classic recruitment strategy. Identify targets with valuable skills and access, then create circumstances that make them vulnerable to financial or personal pressure. Once someone crosses that line, they're trapped in a cycle of increasingly serious compromises. And the flight today? Sullivan was carrying detailed intelligence about your background, your current legal situation, and a comprehensive plan for your recruitment, Agent Park explained. He was traveling to a meeting with foreign contacts who specialize in turning compromised American assets. The heart attack was probably triggered when he realized that our aircraft tracking systems had identified his modified briefcase. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what they were telling me. For months, I had believed that I was the victim of corporate retaliation for exposing safety violations. The reality was far more complex and dangerous. What happens now? I asked. Rodriguez and Agent Park exchanged glances before Rodriguez answered. That depends on you, Ms. Hayes. We need someone with your technical background and military experience to help us understand the full scope of this compromise. The information Sullivan was carrying suggests that the sabotage extends far beyond Meridian defense contractors. You want me to work with your investigation? We want you to help us save American lives, Agent Park said bluntly. The intelligence Sullivan was carrying includes references to other defense contractors, other projects, and other personnel who may be involved in this network. You have the technical expertise to evaluate their claims and the professional credibility to get access to information that might not be available to outside investigators. The irony was overwhelming. The same expertise that had made me a target for foreign recruitment was now being sought by American counterintelligence services. The safety violations that had destroyed my civilian career were actually evidence of a much larger threat to national security. Over the next several hours, Rodriguez and Agent Park walked me through everything they knew about the intelligence network that had targeted me. The operation was sophisticated and international in scope, involving defense contractors in multiple countries and intelligence services from at least 3 hostile nations. The ultimate goal was not just to steal American military technology, but to introduce vulnerabilities that could be exploited during future conflicts. The modified engine components I had flagged were just one example. Similar sabotage efforts were suspected in radar systems, communications equipment, and even basic structural components. The network had been operating for years, slowly introducing defects and vulnerabilities that would be difficult to detect during peacetime operations, but could prove catastrophic during combat situations. How many aircraft are affected? I asked. We don't know, Rodriguez admitted. That's one of the things we need your help to determine. The falsified testing data you uncovered at Meridian appears to be part of a template that has been used at other contractors. But we need someone with your background to evaluate the technical claims and determine which ones represent genuine threats. Agent Park opened another file folder and showed me organizational charts that mapped the suspected network. The scope was staggering: dozens of companies, hundreds of individuals, and thousands of potentially compromised components spread throughout the American defense industrial base. This is going to take years to unravel, I said. Which is why we need to start immediately, Rodriguez replied. Every day we delay gives them more opportunities to introduce additional compromises or to activate existing vulnerabilities. We're essentially in a race against time to identify and neutralize threats that have been years in the making. The weight of responsibility was enormous. The same attention to detail that had driven me to document safety violations at Meridian was now needed to help protect the entire American military aviation fleet. The professional skills that had made me unemployable in the defense industry were suddenly in desperate demand by the people responsible for national security. But there was another dimension to the situation that both Rodriguez and Agent Park seemed to understand without explicitly acknowledging. My persecution by Sullivan and his associates had given me a personal motivation that went beyond professional duty. They had destroyed my career, ruined my reputation, and tried to force me into betraying my country. Now I had the opportunity to turn their own tactics against them. I'll need access to classified databases and testing facilities, I said. And I'll need protection from legal retaliation. Sullivan's network has already demonstrated their willingness to use federal law enforcement agencies as weapons against their targets. Already arranged, Agent Park replied. Your security clearances are being reinstated under national security provisions. You'll have access to whatever resources you need, and legal immunity for any actions taken in support of this investigation. Rodriguez leaned forward. Ms. Hayes, I want you to understand something. What we're asking you to do is dangerous. This network has killed people who threatened their operations. Your involvement in this investigation will make you a high-priority target for elimination. The warning was sobering, but not surprising. I had already been living under the threat of legal destruction for months. Physical danger was simply another form of pressure that I would have to manage. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Sullivan's arrest will trigger immediate security responses from his network, Agent Park explained. They'll start destroying evidence and eliminating loose ends within hours. We have maybe 72 hours to gather as much intelligence as possible before they go completely underground. And after that? After that, we start the long process of identifying every compromised component, every sabotaged system, and every person who has been recruited or coerced into supporting their operation, Rodriguez said. It will take years, but it has to be done. I thought about the pilots I had known during my Air Force service, the maintenance crews who trusted that every component in their aircraft had been tested and certified to the highest standards. I thought about the families who said goodbye to service members every day, never knowing whether their loved ones would come home safely. I thought about the young engineers and technicians who were just starting their careers in defense contracting, unaware that they were working in an environment where some of their colleagues were actively trying to kill American military personnel. When do we start? I asked. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since entering the room. We already have. While we've been talking, our teams have been executing search warrants at Meridian facilities across the country. Sullivan's briefcase contained enough intelligence to identify specific files, computer systems, and personnel that need immediate investigation. Agent Park handed me a secure phone and a set of credentials. Your first assignment is to review the technical documentation that we've seized from Sullivan. We need you to identify which components represent immediate threats that require emergency action, and which ones can be addressed through normal replacement cycles. The phone buzzed with an incoming message containing access codes for secure databases. As I scrolled through the initial file listings, I could see references to dozens of aircraft systems and hundreds of individual components. The scope of the sabotage was even larger than Rodriguez and Agent Park had initially suggested. There's something else, Rodriguez said quietly. Sullivan's intelligence files contain detailed, personal information about other potential recruitment targets within the defense industry. People with backgrounds similar to yours who might be vulnerable to the same kind of pressure tactics that were used against you. The implication was clear. Sullivan's network had been building a comprehensive database of potential assets, looking for people who could be compromised and recruited. I had been just one target among many in a systematic effort to infiltrate American defense contractors. How many others? At least 50 that we've identified so far, Agent Park replied. Engineers, technicians, quality assurance specialists, project managers, anyone with access to sensitive information and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited. I thought about my former colleagues at Meridian and other defense contractors, wondering how many of them had been targeted for recruitment or had already been successfully compromised. The paranoia that had consumed my life for the past several months suddenly seemed entirely justified. We'll need to warn them, I said. We will, Rodriguez assured me. But first we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Sullivan's network has been operating for years, and they've had time to establish deep cover and multiple backup plans. If we move too quickly, we risk driving them further underground without fully exposing their operations. The next several hours passed in a blur of technical reviews, security briefings, and strategic planning sessions. As I worked through the captured intelligence files, the true sophistication of Sullivan's network became apparent. They had not simply been stealing information or introducing random defects into military equipment. They had been conducting a systematic campaign of technological sabotage designed to compromise American military capabilities in ways that would only become apparent during actual combat operations. The modified engine components were designed to fail during high-stress maneuvers, potentially causing aircraft losses during critical missions. Radar systems had been subtly altered to create blind spots that enemy aircraft could exploit. Communications equipment included backdoors that would allow hostile intelligence services to intercept and decode sensitive transmissions. Even basic structural components had been weakened in ways that would compromise aircraft performance under extreme conditions. Each individual modification was subtle enough to pass standard testing procedures, but collectively they represented a comprehensive effort to undermine the technological advantages that American military forces had traditionally relied upon. The implications for national security were staggering. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, I found myself working alongside teams of investigators, analysts, and technical specialists who were as dedicated to their mission as I had been to mine during my Air Force service. For the first time in months, I was surrounded by people who understood the importance of getting technical details right and who shared my commitment to protecting the lives of military personnel. The irony was not lost on me. Sullivan's attempt to recruit me as a foreign asset had backfired spectacularly, delivering me directly into the hands of the people who were working to defeat his network. His elaborate plan to isolate and compromise me had instead given me the perfect opportunity to use my skills and experience in support of American national security interests. But as I worked through the captured files, I realized that our investigation was just beginning. Sullivan's network had been operating for years, and they had established deep roots throughout the defense industrial complex. Exposing and neutralizing their operations would require sustained effort, careful coordination, and the kind of attention to detail that had defined my entire professional career. The stakes could not have been higher. American military personnel were already flying aircraft with compromised components, operating equipment with hidden vulnerabilities, and depending on systems that had been deliberately sabotaged. Every day we delayed in addressing these threats increased the likelihood that enemy forces would exploit them during future conflicts. As I prepared for what would be the most important work of my career, I thought about the oath I had taken when I first joined the Air Force to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sullivan and his network represented both categories of threat, and stopping them had become my new mission. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I was ready to take it directly to the people who had tried to destroy me. They had underestimated the dedication of someone who had spent 8 years ensuring the safety of military aircraft and the people who flew them. Now they were about to discover exactly how dangerous that expertise could be when turned against them. The secure conference room at Peterson Air Force Base had been transformed into a command center over the past 48 hours. Multiple screens lined the walls, displaying real-time data feeds from defense contractors across the country. Technical specialists worked at computer terminals, analyzing the intelligence we had extracted from Sullivan's files and cross-referencing it with known vulnerabilities in military aircraft systems. I stood before a presentation screen, pointing to a complex diagram that showed the relationship between compromised components and potential failure cascades. The audience consisted of senior military officers, federal investigators, and technical experts from various agencies who had been cleared for this unprecedented briefing. The engine modification package represents just the beginning, I explained, highlighting specific areas of the diagram with a laser pointer. Our analysis shows that Sullivan's network has been systematically targeting interdependent systems. When these compromised components are combined in a single aircraft, they create failure modes that are exponentially more dangerous than individual defects. General Patricia Morrison, the commanding officer of Air Combat Command, leaned forward in her chair. "Are you saying that these sabotage efforts were coordinated to create specific vulnerabilities in our most advanced fighters?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," I replied. The network didn't just want to steal information or cause random failures. They engineered a systematic degradation of combat effectiveness that would manifest during high-stress operations. An enemy force that knew about these vulnerabilities could exploit them to achieve tactical advantages that would otherwise be impossible against American air power. Agent Park activated another screen showing a map of defense contractor locations. Red markers indicated facilities where compromised components had been manufactured, while yellow markers showed installations where those components had been installed in operational aircraft. "Based on Ms. Hayes' analysis," Agent Park said, "we estimate that approximately 30% of our current fighter aircraft fleet contains at least one compromised component. 15% contain multiple compromised systems that could interact to create catastrophic failures." The silence in the room was profound. These were experienced military professionals who had dealt with equipment failures and combat losses throughout their careers. But the scope of this sabotage operation was unlike anything in their previous experience. Colonel Rodriguez stood and addressed the group. "The intelligence we've gathered over the past 2 days indicates that Sullivan's network has been preparing for a specific triggering event. They haven't been randomly introducing defects. They've been positioning assets for a coordinated attack on American air superiority." "What kind of triggering event?" asked General Morrison. I stepped forward to answer. "Our analysis suggests they've been preparing for a scenario where American fighters would be operating at maximum stress levels over an extended period. The kind of situation that would occur during a major regional conflict or a large-scale intervention operation. The components are designed to fail under conditions that would only occur during sustained combat operations," Agent Park continued. "Peacetime training flights and routine patrols wouldn't generate sufficient stress to trigger the engineered failures. But during actual combat, with pilots pushing aircraft to their operational limits, these vulnerabilities would manifest as seemingly random equipment failures." General Morrison's expression was grim. "How long would it take to inspect and replace all potentially compromised components?" "Under normal circumstances, 18 to 24 months, I replied. "But we don't have normal circumstances. Sullivan's arrest has undoubtedly triggered emergency protocols within his network. They're probably activating sleeper assets and accelerating their timeline for whatever operation they've been preparing. Rodriguez pulled up intelligence reports on his tablet. Our counterintelligence teams have identified increased activity among suspected network members over the past 36 hours. Electronic communications have spiked, travel patterns have changed, and several key individuals have suddenly altered their daily routines. They know we're onto them, Agent Park said. Which means they're either preparing to disappear completely, or they're moving to an operational phase that doesn't require long-term cover maintenance. The implications were terrifying. If Sullivan's network was preparing to activate their sabotage campaign, American military aircraft could start experiencing catastrophic failures during their next major deployment. Pilots who had trained for years to defend their country could find themselves flying aircraft that had been deliberately engineered to fail at the worst possible moments. I turned to address General Morrison directly. "Ma'am, we need to implement emergency inspection protocols immediately. I've prepared a prioritized list of components and systems that represent the highest risk. If we can focus our initial efforts on the most critical vulnerabilities, we might be able to prevent the worst-case scenarios while we work on the broader remediation effort." "What kind of resources would that require?" Morrison asked. "Every available maintenance facility, every qualified inspector, and probably civilian contractors working around the clock," I replied. "We're essentially talking about a complete safety review of the entire combat aircraft fleet, compressed into a time frame that would normally be considered impossible." Rodriguez activated another display showing personnel assignments and facility locations. "We've already begun mobilizing inspection teams and prioritizing aircraft based on deployment schedules. Units that are currently deployed or scheduled for deployment within the next 60 days are getting immediate attention." Agent Park opened a classified folder and distributed copies of a document to everyone in the room. "This is our current assessment of Sullivan's network structure. We've identified 43 individuals who have definitive connections to the sabotage operation, and another 112 who have suspicious associations that require investigation." I studied the organizational chart, recognizing several names from my time in the defense industry. The network was more extensive than I had initially realized, with tentacles reaching into virtually every major defense contractor and several key Pentagon offices. "The challenge we face," Agent Park continued, "is that many of these individuals are in positions where they could cause significant additional damage if they realize we're closing in on them. We need to move carefully to avoid triggering defensive responses that could compromise ongoing operations or endanger military personnel." General Morrison stood and walked to the map display. "What about international implications? If this network has been operating for years, they've probably established similar operations in other countries." "That's our next phase of investigation," Rodriguez replied. "We have preliminary indications that similar sabotage campaigns have been targeting Allied air forces, particularly those that operate American-designed aircraft or use American-manufactured components." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer, and it was more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. This wasn't just an attack on American military capabilities. It was a systematic effort to undermine the entire Western Alliance's air power advantage. "We need international cooperation," I said. "The technical expertise required to identify these vulnerabilities exists in multiple countries, and the manufacturing chains involved in these compromised components span the global defense industry." Agent Park nodded in agreement. "We're already coordinating with Allied intelligence services, but the sensitivity of the information makes it difficult to share details without compromising ongoing operations." The next several hours involved detailed technical discussions about inspection procedures, component replacement schedules, and security protocols for protecting uncompromised aircraft. As we worked through the logistics, I found myself drawing on every aspect of my Air Force experience, from technical knowledge about aircraft systems to understanding of military operational requirements. The most challenging aspect was balancing the need for immediate action against the risk of alerting Sullivan's network to the full extent of our knowledge. Every inspection we conducted, every component we replaced, and every person we investigated created the possibility that our targets would realize how much we had learned and respond accordingly. We need a deception operation, I suggested during one of our planning sessions. If we can make Sullivan's network believe that we're focused on a narrower problem than we actually understand, we might be able to buy time to address the most critical vulnerabilities before they realize the scope of our response. Rodriguez looked interested. What kind of deception? We leak information suggesting that we think Sullivan was operating alone or with a very small group, I explained. We focus publicly on Meridian defense contractors and make it appear that we believe the problem is limited to that one company. Meanwhile, we quietly expand our investigation to other contractors without drawing attention to the broader network. Agent Park considered the proposal. That could work, but it would require careful coordination with our media strategy and our law enforcement activities. We'd need to make sure that our public statements support the deception, while still allowing us to take the investigative actions we need. General Morrison approved the approach. Do it. We need every advantage we can get in this situation. Over the following days, I worked with teams of inspectors and analysts to implement the emergency safety review. The pace was exhausting, with 18-hour days spent reviewing technical documentation, analyzing component specifications, and coordinating with maintenance facilities across the country. The work was familiar in many ways, reminiscent of my Air Force quality assurance duties, but the stakes were higher than anything I had previously experienced. Every component we flagged for replacement represented potential lives saved. Every vulnerability we identified and addressed reduced the tactical advantages that enemy forces might exploit during future conflicts. But the emotional weight of the work was equally significant. As we uncovered more details about the extent of the sabotage, I found myself thinking constantly about the pilots, who had been unknowingly flying compromised aircraft for months or even years. Some of them were people I had worked with during my military service, colleagues who had trusted that every component in their aircraft had been tested and certified to the highest standards. The betrayal was personal as well as professional. Sullivan and his network had perverted the very systems that were designed to protect American military personnel. They had turned quality assurance processes into weapons, using the trust that existed between contractors and military customers to introduce vulnerabilities that could kill the people they were supposed to be protecting. During one particularly difficult day, as we worked through intelligence that revealed the full scope of a sabotaged radar system modification, I received a phone call that brought the human dimension of our work into sharp focus. The caller was Captain Sarah Kim, an F-16 pilot I had worked with during my time at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. She was currently deployed in Eastern Europe as part of NATO deterrence operations, and she had heard through military channels that I was involved in some kind of safety investigation. "Victoria," she said, her voice crackling through the secure connection, "I need to know if there's something I should be worried about with my aircraft. The rumors I'm hearing are pretty scary." I couldn't give her specific details about our investigation, but I was able to reassure her that her particular aircraft had been cleared during our initial safety sweep. What I couldn't tell her was that 3 other aircraft in her squadron were still awaiting critical component replacements. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to be extra careful over the next few weeks. Follow all maintenance protocols exactly, and don't hesitate to ground your aircraft if you notice anything unusual, no matter how minor it might seem." "That bad?" she asked. "Just be careful," I repeated, "and make sure your squadron mates know the same thing." After ending the call, I stared at the technical diagrams spread across my desk and felt the full weight of responsibility for the safety of people like Sarah. The abstract technical analysis I had been conducting for days suddenly had faces and names attached to it. That evening, Colonel Rodriguez found me still working in the conference room long after most of the other team members had gone to their quarters. "You need to get some rest," he said, settling into a chair across from me. "There are still too many unknowns," I replied, gesturing to the stacks of documentation I had been reviewing. "Every hour we delay increases the risk that one of these compromised components will fail at exactly the wrong moment." Rodriguez studied the exhaustion that I knew must be visible on my face. "Victoria, you've been working nonstop for 72 hours. You're not going to save anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "I can't stop thinking about the people who are flying these aircraft right now," I said. "Sarah Kim called me today, and I had to tell her to be careful without being able to explain why. There are hundreds of pilots out there in the same situation, and we're doing everything we can to protect them," Rodriguez replied. "But this is a marathon, not a sprint. Sullivan's network has been operating for years. We're not going to solve this problem in a single week." I knew he was right, but the urgency I felt was overwhelming. Every technical document I reviewed, every component specification I analyzed, and every vulnerability I identified felt like a race against time to prevent disasters that could occur without warning. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "We've received intelligence that suggests Sullivan's network is planning some kind of operational test of their sabotage capabilities. We don't know the details yet, but it appears they want to validate their ability to cause aircraft failures under controlled conditions." The news hit me like a physical blow. "They're planning to murder American pilots as a proof of concept." "That's what it looks like," Rodriguez replied grimly. "Which means our timeline just got much shorter. If they're moving to an active testing phase, we need to identify and neutralize their capabilities before they can demonstrate their effectiveness." The stakes had just escalated beyond anything I had previously imagined. Sullivan's network wasn't just preparing for some future conflict. They were actively planning to kill American military personnel in the immediate term. I gathered the technical documents I had been reviewing and organized them into priority categories. "We need to accelerate everything. The components with the highest failure probability under stress conditions, those have to be our absolute top priority." "Agreed," Rodriguez said. "I'm authorizing emergency protocols that will give us access to additional resources and personnel. But I need you to understand that what we're asking you to do is unprecedented. No one has ever attempted a safety review of this scope and complexity under these time constraints." "Then we'll have to figure out how to do it," I replied, "because the alternative is unacceptable." As Rodriguez left to coordinate the expanded investigation effort, I returned to my analysis with renewed focus. The technical challenges were enormous, but they were solvable with sufficient expertise and resources. The time pressure was intense, but it could be managed with careful prioritization and efficient processes. What worried me most was the human dimension. Somewhere out there, Sullivan's network was planning to murder American pilots to demonstrate their capabilities. Those pilots were people like Sarah Kim, dedicated professionals who had committed their lives to defending their country. They deserved better than to be used as test subjects for an enemy sabotage operation. The work ahead would be the most important of my career, and possibly of my life. Everything I had learned during 8 years of Air Force service, everything I had discovered during my investigation of Meridian defense contractors, and everything I had uncovered during our analysis of Sullivan's network would be brought to bear on preventing a tragedy of unprecedented scope. As I prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging phase of our investigation, I thought about the oath I had taken when I first joined the Air Force, the commitment to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, had never felt more relevant or more urgent. Sullivan and his network represented the worst kind of enemy, one that used our own systems and processes against us, that perverted the trust and cooperation that made American military effectiveness possible. They had tried to destroy me personally, and now they were threatening to destroy the people I had spent my career trying to protect. The fight was far from over, but I was ready to take it to them with everything I had. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning on our 7th day of investigation, when cryptanalysts working on Sullivan's encrypted communications finally cracked his personal messaging system. The intelligence they recovered revealed the location and timing of the operational test that Sullivan's network had been planning. Agent Park burst into the secure conference room where I had been working through component failure analyses with a team of technical specialists. Her face was flushed with the kind of urgent energy that comes from discovering something both terrible and actionable. "They're targeting Kadena Air Base," she announced, spreading aerial photographs across our work table. 18 F-16s from the 18th Wing are scheduled for a training exercise in 6 hours. Sullivan's network has people positioned to observe and document the failures they expect their sabotaged components to cause. Colonel Rodriguez appeared in the doorway behind her, speaking rapidly into a secure phone while gesturing for us to continue the briefing. The weight of imminent crisis filled the room like smoke. I studied the training exercise details that Agent Park had provided. High-stress formation flying, air-to-air combat simulations, and extended afterburner operations. Exactly the conditions that would trigger the engineered failures we had been documenting for the past week. How many of those aircraft contain compromised components? I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be devastating. Agent Park consulted her tablet. "Based on your analysis and our component tracking, 14 of the 18 aircraft have at least one compromised system. 7 have multiple vulnerabilities that could cascade into catastrophic failures." The mathematics of disaster were stark. If Sullivan's network had calculated correctly, we were looking at the potential loss of multiple aircraft and pilots during a routine training exercise. The enemy wouldn't even need to fire a shot. They would simply watch American military personnel killed by their own equipment. Rodriguez finished his phone conversation and joined our huddle around the photographs. "I've got General Morrison mobilizing every available transport to get emergency inspection teams to Kadena immediately. But the time difference and flight duration mean we can't get qualified personnel there before the exercise begins." "What about the local maintenance crews?" I asked. "They're good, but they don't have the specialized knowledge needed to identify these specific vulnerabilities," Rodriguez replied. "The sabotage was designed to be invisible to standard inspection procedures." Agent Park pulled up satellite imagery of Kadena Air Base on her laptop. "There's another complication. We have intelligence suggesting that Sullivan's network has assets positioned around the base to monitor the exercise. If we ground the aircraft or abort the mission, they'll know we've discovered their capabilities and they'll disappear before we can arrest them." The tactical dilemma was brutal. If we allowed the exercise to proceed, American pilots would almost certainly die. If we prevented the exercise, we would lose our best opportunity to capture the people responsible for years of systematic sabotage. "There has to be a third option," I said, studying the exercise parameters and aircraft assignments. "What if we could modify the exercise profile to reduce the stress loads on the most vulnerable aircraft?" Rodriguez looked skeptical. "The wing commander at Kadena doesn't know about our investigation. From his perspective, any last-minute changes would look suspicious and unprofessional. Then we need to get someone to Kadena who can make the changes from inside the system," I said. "Someone with the technical authority to modify exercise parameters for safety reasons." Agent Park understood immediately where I was going with this. "You want to fly to Japan and personally oversee the safety modifications?" "It's the only way," I replied. I have the technical expertise to identify exactly which maneuvers would trigger failures in specific aircraft, and I have enough military credibility to convince a wing commander to make safety-related changes to a training exercise. Rodriguez checked his watch. The fastest military transport we can arrange would get you to Kadena, with maybe 90 minutes to spare before the exercise begins. That's assuming perfect weather and no delays. Then we better get moving, I said, already gathering the technical documentation I would need to brief the Kadena maintenance crews and flight operations personnel. The flight to Kadena Air Base was the longest 8 hours of my life. I spent the entire journey reviewing aircraft-specific vulnerability assessments and developing contingency plans for different failure scenarios. The C-17 transport was equipped with secure communications equipment that allowed me to coordinate with Rodriguez's team at Peterson Air Force Base. But the time pressure was relentless. As we crossed the international date line, I found myself thinking about the pilots who would be participating in the training exercise. They were probably conducting final briefings at that moment, reviewing flight profiles and emergency procedures, completely unaware that their own aircraft had been weaponized against them. The irony was overwhelming. These pilots had trained for years to defend against external threats, enemy fighters, surface-to-air missiles, electronic warfare systems. But the most dangerous threat they faced came from within their own supply chain, from the very people who were supposed to be ensuring their safety and effectiveness. When we landed at Kadena, I was met by Colonel Michael Chun, the wing commander, and his senior staff. They had been told only that a critical safety issue required immediate consultation with a technical specialist from the continental United States. Chun was clearly frustrated by the lack of detail and the disruption to his wing's training schedule. "Ms. Hayes," he said as we walked quickly toward the maintenance hangar, "I hope you understand that my pilots have been preparing for this exercise for weeks. Any changes at this point had better be absolutely necessary." "Colonel," I replied, "what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully because lives depend on it." Over the next 45 minutes, I briefed Chun and his staff on everything we had discovered about Sullivan's network and the systematic sabotage of aircraft components. I showed them the technical evidence, the intelligence we had gathered, and the specific vulnerabilities that had been engineered into aircraft in his wing. The transformation in Chun's demeanor was immediate and complete. The frustrated commander became a focused professional, dealing with an unprecedented threat to his people and mission. "What do you need from us?" he asked. I spread detailed aircraft assignments across his conference table. "I need to modify the exercise profile to reduce stress on the most vulnerable aircraft. And I need your best maintenance personnel to conduct emergency inspections on components that our analysis has flagged as highest risk." Chun nodded and began making phone calls to delay the exercise start time and mobilize additional maintenance crews. As his staff worked to implement the safety modifications, I found myself in the familiar environment of a military maintenance hangar, surrounded by the tools and expertise that had defined my Air Force career. The next 2 hours were a blur of technical inspections, component replacements, and flight profile modifications. Working alongside Kadena's maintenance crews, I was able to identify and address the most critical vulnerabilities in the aircraft scheduled for the exercise. But as we worked, I became increasingly aware that Sullivan's network was watching. The intelligence reports from Rodriguez's team indicated increased electronic surveillance around the base, and our counterintelligence personnel had identified several individuals with suspicious credentials attempting to gain access to areas overlooking the flight line. The enemy was positioned and ready to observe the disaster they had engineered. When that disaster failed to materialize, they would know immediately that their operation had been compromised. As the modified exercise finally began, I watched from the control tower alongside Chun and his operations staff. The F-16s took off in perfect formation, their engines performing flawlessly despite the sabotage components that should have caused catastrophic failures. "Phoenix Lead is airborne," the radio crackled with the voice of the exercise commander. "All aircraft report normal systems." I felt a wave of relief, but I knew our work was far from finished. Preventing the immediate disaster had been only the first step. Now we had to capitalize on our success to capture the people responsible. Agent Park's voice came through my secure radio. "Victoria, our surveillance teams have visual contact with 3 individuals who are clearly disappointed by the lack of aircraft failures. They're preparing to leave their observation positions. Don't lose them," I replied. "This is our only chance to roll up the entire network." Over the following hours, as the training exercise continued without incident, federal agents and military police conducted simultaneous arrests at 12 locations across Okinawa and the surrounding islands. The individuals they captured included foreign intelligence operatives, compromised American personnel, and technical specialists who had been part of Sullivan's sabotage network for years. The intelligence recovered from these arrests provided the final pieces of evidence needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Sullivan's network had been far more extensive than we had initially realized, with operations targeting not just American military aircraft, but also the air forces of allied nations throughout the Pacific region. But perhaps the most significant discovery came from encrypted communications that revealed the network's ultimate objective. They hadn't been preparing for a single operational test or even a limited sabotage campaign. They had been positioning assets for a coordinated attack on American and Allied air power that would coincide with a major regional conflict. The sabotage components were designed to fail simultaneously during the high-stress operations that would occur during the opening phases of a war. Enemy forces would have achieved air superiority not through superior technology or tactics, but by exploiting vulnerabilities that had been deliberately introduced into Western military aircraft over a period of years. 2 weeks later, I found myself back in the Pentagon, briefing a joint session of congressional oversight committees on the investigation that had consumed my life for the better part of a month. The classified hearing room was packed with senators and representatives who were struggling to understand how such an extensive compromise of American military capabilities had been possible. "The network we uncovered represents a new form of warfare," I explained to the assembled legislators. "Rather than attacking our forces directly, enemy intelligence services systematically corrupted our own defense industrial base. They turned our manufacturing processes, our quality assurance systems, and our supply chains into weapons against us." Senator Elizabeth Warren, the chair of the Armed Services Committee, leaned forward. "Ms. Hayes, in your professional opinion, how long would it have taken for this sabotage campaign to achieve its objectives?" "Based on the component failure models we analyzed, I believe they were preparing for implementation within the next 12 to 18 months, I replied. A major conflict during that time frame could have resulted in the catastrophic loss of American air superiority within days of combat operations beginning. The implications of what I was describing were staggering to people who had spent their careers assuming American technological superiority. The idea that enemy forces could neutralize advanced American fighters without firing a shot challenged fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. Representative Adam Smith, the ranking member of the committee, asked the question that had been hanging over our entire investigation: how do we prevent this from happening again? I had been preparing for this question for weeks, and my answer reflected everything I had learned during my years in quality assurance and my recent immersion in counterintelligence operations. We need to fundamentally restructure how we approach defense contractor oversight, I said. The current system assumes that contractors are acting in good faith and focuses on compliance with specifications rather than verification of actual performance. We need independent technical auditing, redundant testing procedures, and continuous monitoring systems that can detect subtle sabotage before it reaches operational aircraft. But even as I outlined these recommendations, I knew they represented only part of the solution. The real challenge was cultural, changing an industrial system that prioritized efficiency and cost reduction over the kind of meticulous attention to detail that could detect sophisticated sabotage. 6 months later, I received an invitation that brought my journey full circle. The Air Force was establishing a new quality assurance institute dedicated to developing advanced techniques for detecting sabotage and ensuring the flawless integrity of military aircraft systems. They wanted me to serve as the founding director. Standing in the same Pentagon hallway where Derek Sullivan had once tried to destroy my career, I thought about the path that had led me from a disgraced whistleblower sitting in seat 11C to a person entrusted with safeguarding American air power against future threats. The offer represented everything I had worked toward during my military service and everything I had fought for during the darkest period of my civilian career. It was an opportunity to transform the painful lessons of Sullivan's conspiracy into systematic protections that would prevent similar attacks in the future. As I accepted the position, I realized that my experience had taught me something fundamental about the nature of service and dedication. The most important work often happens in the shadows, conducted by people whose names will never appear in headlines, but whose attention to detail and commitment to excellence makes the difference between safety and disaster. The fighter pilots, who had participated in that training exercise at Kadena, would never know how close they had come to being killed by their own equipment. The families who welcomed those pilots home safely would never understand that their loved ones' survival had depended on catching sabotage that was years in the making. But that anonymity was exactly as it should be. The best quality assurance work prevents disasters that never happen, protects lives that are never consciously at risk, and maintains capabilities that are never dramatically tested. Success is measured not in recognition or gratitude, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that people are safer because of work done well in obscurity. The legend that those F-16 pilots had unknowingly saluted was not about individual heroism or dramatic victories. It was about the patient, methodical work of finding problems before they could kill people. It was about the dedication to keep trying even when the system seemed to be working against you. It was about the commitment to serve something larger than yourself, even when that service goes unnoticed and unrewarded. As I walked through the Pentagon toward my new office, I thought about all the young engineers and technicians who were just beginning their careers in defense contracting. They would face challenges and temptations that I could barely imagine, and some of them would undoubtedly be targeted by enemies who understood that corruption was more effective than conventional weapons. My job now was to give them the tools and knowledge they would need to recognize those threats and resist those temptations. It was to build systems that could detect sabotage before it reached the field, and to create a culture where doing the right thing was always more important than avoiding controversy. The work would be difficult, often frustrating, and always thankless. But it was exactly the work that needed to be done by someone who understood both its importance and its challenges. And for the first time since this journey began, I felt ready to embrace that responsibility completely. The aircraft flying overhead as I entered the building were safer because of what we had accomplished. The pilots who flew them were protected by systems and procedures that had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. And the country they served had been defended by people who understood that the most effective battles are often fought and won before anyone realizes they were taking place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.